Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We want to extend our gratuity, our thankfulness, our gratefulness to Temple Beth-El and our staff, and also to the Jewish Community Relations Council of the Jewish Federation of San Antonio for putting on this program tonight, which was planned months ago, but it sounds like we knew what we needed right now, but we planned this months ago. I am honored to present Ambassador Dennis Ross, who has dealt with every Israeli prime minister for the past 30 years, having the unusual distinction of being a political appointee for 2 Republican and 2 Democratic presidents, Reagan and Bush 41, Clinton and Obama. He developed close relationships with 5 Israeli prime ministers, Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, Ehud Barak, Ariel Sharon, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Few people know the history of Israel, its efforts on peace, or its relations with the Arabs and the region better than him. Dennis Ross and David Makovsky's new book, Be Strong and of Good Courage, How Israel's Most Important Leaders Shaped Its Destiny, came out on September 3rd, 2019, to immediate acclaim. The book is an inspiring history of those moments when Israel, a country born in existential peril, faced choices that required extraordinary acts of leadership and judgment to secure its future. The story chronicles 4 of Israel's most important leaders, David Ben-Gurion, Menachem Begin, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ariel Sharon, each of whom made historic decisions in the face of fierce opposition. Here, authors Ross and Makovsky provide fascinating portraits of these founding figures, their conviction, character, and their political courage, and the lessons that their decisions could provide Israel's leaders today as they confront the fateful choice needed to preserve Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. This evening, the way our program will run is we will have Ambassador Ross speak for about an hour. During that presentation, we gave you cards and little pencils. If you need, they're up here. If you have questions that you would like to ask, you will raise those and Temple Beth-El staff will come and collect them. We will stop collecting at 7:45, where we will move into a Q&A opportunity with Ambassador Ross. It is my honor and privilege to welcome Ambassador Ross to our bima.
So it's nice to be here. When we originally planned this, as the rabbi said, we really had something very different in mind. The truth is I'm actually working on a new book, and it's all about what America's role in the world should be, America's traditions, how you can sustain that role, and I'm not going to say anything about that tonight. Normally I like to start off with something light because usually the topic is very heavy. And I have to be honest, I just don't feel like that. This has been an unbelievable 13 days because we witnessed what is the worst day in Israel's history. Israel lost more in this day than it lost in any war on any single day. This is the first war that Israel has had imposed on its people in its territory. The only other war where Israel lost a lot of people within its territory was the War of Independence. It wasn't true in 56, wasn't true in 67, wasn't true in 73, wasn't true in 82. You know, with the asymmetric conflict with Hezbollah and Hamas, where they fire rockets, there were rockets fired into Israel. But there was never a ground onslaught like this. So Israel is dealing, first of all, with what is a complete shock. How many of you have been shocked? Who thought that Israel could suffer this kind of a strategic failure on intelligence and in terms of military ineffectiveness? The answer is really nobody, least of all me. So you have to ask yourself, and I'm sure many people here asking, so how did it happen? I want to address how it could have happened. I want to talk about what Israel does now, although I want to put in perspective what Hamas hoped to achieve, because that relates very much to what Israel needs to do now. And is there a way to take something from what is a catastrophic event in Israel, one that is stunning, shocking, raise basic questions in the minds of most Israelis about, are their capabilities what they once thought they were? Can you take this catastrophic event and turn it into something that could be positive? Even if you can, the process that you're going to have to go through to get there is going to be a profoundly difficult one. I've heard a lot of people say this was Israel's 9/11. I even tweeted that the first day. I guess it's actually called X now, so I didn't really tweet it. I X'd it the first day. But it's not. It's much worse. Israel lost the first day the equivalent of almost 50,000. If you do it proportionally to us. We lost 3,200. They lost the equivalent of 50,000 here. But it's not just that. 9/11 took place. That was it, right? We didn't have any more attacks. That was it. Israel is now dealing with the consequence of this and is now dealing with the need to ensure that not only does nothing like this ever happen again, but it's dealing with the reality that Hamas, as Israel goes through the process of trying to defeat Hamas, and it won't be trying, it has to defeat Hamas, and I'll explain more why later, we already see how the balance of public opinion has shifted. The explosion at the hospital, Al-Halis hospital in Gaza, immediately Hamas blamed Israel, and immediately the world media described this as an Israeli airstrike that killed 500 because the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza, run by Hamas, said 500 people were killed. Now it's a tragedy. Anybody know how many actually were killed? No, it's more than 10. 50. Now that's terrible. But the story is A, Israel did it when they didn't, and B, 10 times the numbers of fatalities that actually took place. And everybody ran with this. Israel at the time actually did what was responsible. They said, we're investigating. They didn't want to come out. If they had done it, and it could have happened in war, mistakes happen. It could have been the Israelis. So it wouldn't have been responsible for them to immediately say, we didn't do it, and then have it come out that they did it. That would destroy their credibility. I'm going to repeat that. That would destroy their credibility. Does anybody seem to care about Hamas's credibility? It's a rhetorical question. Does Hamas respect any rules? No. Does Hamas ever tell the truth? Pretty hard to find an instance of it. Does Israel actively go out there and lie? No. Because in Israel, there's actually accountability. There's no accountability for Hamas. And yet, there was the impulse to rush to judgment. And unfortunately, it's had a huge impact within the Arab world. Only 2 Arab states condemned Hamas. The UAE and Bahrain, both of whom have peace with Israel. But the statements they made were very strong denunciations of Israel for carrying out the bombing. And that's been mirrored, echoed by everyone else. Because there's a fear of how inflamed their publics are over this. And this now creates a climate. One of the best things that President Biden did by going to Israel now was to demonstrate he wasn't afraid to go in the aftermath of this. He was still going to go and he was going to tell the truth, which he did. He told the truth. Israel didn't do it. And that's not always the case. There tends to be an impulse when you see this kind of a reaction in the Arab world to find ways to accommodate it. He didn't do that. Okay, so why did this happen? How did it happen? So let me explain. And I should, before I begin to explain, I should say, there will be a reckoning in Israel over this. There will be an investigation when the war is over. After the 1973 war, after the Yom Kippur War, you had the Argonaut Commission. And it came out with its findings. The war ended the end of October. It came out with its findings in March of 74. You will have a thorough investigation of this. And by the way, you need to have it not only because it's a democracy where you have accountability, but because you need to learn the lessons. What went wrong and why did it go wrong? But I'm going to give you my preliminary judgment of what I see that went wrong. I'll start by saying, in every case of strategic surprise, whether you're talking about Pearl Harbor, or you're talking about 9/11, or you're talking about the 1973 war, or in this case, all the information you needed was there, but you had a set of assumptions, and the assumptions created a prism through which you interpreted those assumptions. And the essential assumption that the Israeli military and intelligence establishment had was that Hamas was not interested in a war at this time. Yahya Sinwar, who is the leader of Hamas in Gaza, had demonstrated over the last couple of years that he was very interested in trying to create an economic floor in Gaza. Gaza is a densely populated area that is small, basically impoverished, and Sinwar was trying to ensure there was a kind of economic floor so things didn't get worse. The view of many of the Israeli analysts, which was not unreasonable, was that he kept showing an interest in having more and more Gazans work in Israel, because every Gazan who worked in Israel made 10 times as much as those who worked in Gaza if you could get a job. 50% unemployment in Gaza. If you have a job, you made 1/10 what you made in Israel. And for every Palestinian who came and worked in Israel, that sort of was the equivalent of affecting a family of 7. So the sense was, okay, we're not going to create such a sense of desperation economically, and Sinwar, seems to have such an interest in avoiding that sense of desperation because Hamas has at least some responsibility to govern, that economic interest is shaping the way Hamas is behaving. They show no signs of wanting a conflict, and there was a pretty powerful example that tended to validate this assumption. You may not remember it, but about 3.5 months ago, the Israelis, as part of what they've been contending with in the West Bank, which became even more pronounced after you had a new Israeli government starting last January, the Israelis succeeded in killing an Islamic Jihad operative in the West Bank. Islamic Jihad in Gaza then fired rockets into Israel in retaliation for the killing of this operative in the West Bank. Israel responded not only by bombing Islamic Jihad sites and facilities in Gaza, but they also killed 2 of the leading commanders of Islamic Jihad in Gaza. And what did Hamas do during 5 days of this exchange? Nothing. They didn't fire any rockets. They didn't react. The Israelis, I was over there at times, the Israelis were telling me they put a lot of pressure on Islamic Jihad to stop. So that seemed to validate the assumption, right? You have 5 days of conflict. Hamas, which is an acronym meaning the Islamic Resistance Movement, while one of the other resistance movements is being beat up by the Israelis, does nothing. That seemed to validate the notion that he's really not looking for a war or conflict with us. And by the way, everyone would say to me that that doesn't mean he never will. We know who he is. We know what his ideology is. We also think we know him. He was in Israeli jails for 23 years. He's fluent in Hebrew. He follows the Israeli press, which means, by the way, he followed very closely 40 weeks of demonstrations in Israel the divisions within Israel. This probably had some impact on the sense of timing. But here you go, here you have the Israelis making an assumption which seemed reasonable and seemingly having it validated by their not responding when they hit Islamic Jihad. I remember having discussions when I was over there. I said, okay, what could be the reason they're not doing this? And the consensus answer was, he really doesn't want to have a conflict or a war with us. He knows what the consequences will be. Now, in the last 3 weeks before what happened on October 7th, there were a set of demonstrations that Hamas had promoted at the wall on the border. And ostensibly, again, what the Israelis thought, was that the reason for the demonstrations was that Qatar had cut the funding to Hamas. They provided a baseline for actually money for Hamas itself. And the Israelis interpreted the demonstrations at the fence, at the wall, as being a function of Hamas trying to heat things up, because they knew if they heated things up, the way Qatar defined its role, it was always going to play the role of trying to calm things in Gaza. So there was a negotiation with Qatar and with the Egyptians to get these demonstrations at the wall stopped. And in the week before October 7th, they reached an agreement. The demonstration stopped. And here again, you seem to have another validation of what was going on in terms of the mindset that the Israelis had about how to think about Hamas. Now, I should note, what was going on in these demonstrations? Large numbers, setting off smoke bombs, smoke grenades. They were obviously surveilling what's the best place along the whole wall for where we should be focusing on breaching it. Where are all the towers with surveillance cameras? Which ones might be most vulnerable to attack? How do we create a kind of cover for ourselves? Number one. Number two, this isn't true for all the Gazans who are going into Israel to work, but it's clear that there were those who were going in there to work, who were doing it in the south, and who basically created the intelligence for this attack. So here's a set of assumptions that help to explain why Israel was so surprised. It's understandable. Now you might ask me, okay, maybe that was understandable, we kind of get it, but how do you explain why Israel was so poorly prepared to deal with the assault once it happened? Why were there so few Israeli military units in the south? Why was there such a slow response? Why was there so much confusion? Why was command control seemingly completely disrupted? How do you explain that? Well, there is an explanation for it. Some of it, I think, relates to deception. And what I mean by that is, over the last couple of months, Hezbollah had become much more provocative along the border in the north with Israel. For one thing, they created a phony front group that was a green movement. You know, like Hamas cares about the environment. This is Hamas who helped to ensure that huge amounts of explosive were stored in the Beirut port and ended up blowing up and destroying a good chunk of Beirut. Yeah, they care about environment. But they created this so-called green movement, and they created positions right along the border. They created towers to be looking into Israel. They built up areas with armaments, all of which is supposed to be excluded because of Security Council Resolution 1701 that was passed in 2006. That works so well that Hezbollah tells the unified forces where they can go and when they can go there. It's supposed to be UNIFIL will keep them out and they shouldn't be able to come in. But it turns out it's UNIFIL that's put in that position. Anyway, they were becoming more provocative from that standpoint, but it wasn't just that. There's something called the Blue Line in Lebanon. When Israel withdrew from Lebanon in May of 2000, beforehand, we worked with the UN for the UN to identify and lay out and designate where was the actual international border between Lebanon and Israel. And so they demarcated what they called the Blue Line. The Blue Line essentially is in a kind of no man's land between sort of two fences. And what did Hamas do? What did Hezbollah do? Hezbollah went and put 2 tents below the Blue Line in Israeli territory. Israel tried to negotiate with UNIFIL to remove it. Eventually they removed 1. At the same time, they started engaging and shooting anti-tank missiles across the border. Now all this led Israel to dramatically build up its presence in the north, because they sensed that maybe Nasrallah, because of what he was saying publicly, Nasrallah was saying that what was happening in Israel showed that Israel was weak. By the way, before Hezbollah carried out a kidnapping in 2006, which triggered the war back then, an ambush and a kidnapping of 8 soldiers, killing several and then kidnapping a couple into Lebanon who actually ultimately died. Before that happened, Nasrallah said, Israel is like a spider web, and it's very weak, and it will fall apart. Now later, he said, after the war that went on for 32 days, he said, if I had known that the Israelis were going to react the way they did, I wouldn't have done it. But now, over the last several months, he began talking about how weak Israel is because of its divisions, and the divisions will destroy it. Then you see him acting in a way that seems to act on that perception, on that declaration. So Israel does the logical thing. They build up their forces in the north, which is necessary, because one of the things they know that Hezbollah seems to have a plan to try to carry out a surprise attack where they would seize some Israeli villages. So Israel built up significantly its presence in the north. So that's one of the reasons that there isn't a serious presence in the south. There's a second reason. The second reason is that the violence in the West Bank involved literally shootings almost every day. Okay? Most of the acts of terror and violence were in the West Bank, not in Israel. Occasionally there was one, but what you had from this government, especially with ministers like Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, was constant pressure for the military to do more in the West Bank, build up more, ensure there couldn't be any violence directed against Israelis. And so what did Israel do? It dramatically built up its presence in the West Bank. Israel does not normally have a large standing army. So you build up your presence in the north, you dramatically increase your presence in the West Bank, in no small part because there's constant pressure from within the government for the military to do more, change its rules of engagement, but increase its presence to prevent the shooting attacks. Now in the south, you think, okay, we got the barrier there. By the way, Israel spent $1 billion to build an underground barrier so that from Gaza, you could not tunnel into Israel. How was Gilad Shalit captured? Hamas operatives coming through a tunnel. So the sense was, we have blocked their ability to build tunnels into Israel. We have an above-ground barrier. We have all these towers with surveillance cameras. So we don't need much of a presence here. And we will pick up any intelligence that is necessary to give us the warning we need. And if we pick up something, then we'll go ahead and we'll mobilize our forces and they'll be down there and they can stop them. So you have a set of assumptions that are married to a repositioning of Israeli forces a belief that the South is quiet because Sinwar doesn't have any interest in doing anything, and a belief that if there is a problem, you'll be able to get your forces there because you'll have plenty of advance notice. So what I'm describing is a perfect storm. Now I'm going to add one other element that I think explains part of the problem. And when I say this, I can't tell you I know it, but I've heard enough anecdotal evidence about it that it suggests it was part of the command control problem and the slow response. So the attack comes on Simchat Torah. It's a combination of Shabbat and Simchat Torah. More and more of the officer corps in Israel wear kippah. More and more of them are observant. And they had their phones off because it was Simchat Torah. Now, maybe when the investigation is done, we'll find this was only a small part of it. I suspect there's an element here. You put this all together, and it helps to explain that A, there's a complete strategic surprise, and they're able to blind the surveillance cameras. They use drones to blind the surveillance cameras. They go and they planted explosives to blow up the wall, and then they had bulldozers ready to knock it down, what was left of it. I hear people say, boy, Hamas succeeded beyond its wild expectations. What they really had in mind was just coming in and grabbing a few hostage and going back. They were surprised by how little resistance. Maybe they were surprised by how little resistance, but you don't send 1,800 people in to grab just a couple of hostages. And what was discovered on those who were killed, they had maps. They had maps of all these communities. They knew about the music festival. They went directly there. They singled out some of the communities. Their targets were schools. No, what we saw, this was deliberate. Maybe they didn't think they would be as successful because maybe they thought they would face more resistance. One of the reasons for the slow Israeli response was also some of the confusion. Many of the Hamas guys came in wearing IDF uniforms. So the idea that you could send helicopters down there, you didn't know who you had to go after. So this is, a combination of circumstances that literally could not have been worse. One of the things to bear in mind is the level of heroism on the Israeli side is literally unbelievable. I don't know how many of you saw Amir T-Bone on 60 Minutes or have read his account that was in the Atlantic. But, he is lived in the kibbutz Nahul Oz, and he is in their safe room, locked for 12 hours with his wife and 2 little daughters. He calls his father a retired general, and his father says, "I'm coming to get you." Now, Amir is fluent in Arabic, so he can hear what's being said outside. They're trying to break in. They aren't able to do it. They get distracted. The power in his phone eventually goes out. They're sitting there in the dark for 12 hours. They're asking the 2 little girls to be quiet, to be as silent as they can be. They're living there literally in terror. And his father, he comes down. Along the way, he sees small Israeli units that have rushed down there that get ambushed because Hamas comes in and they set up ambushes on the roads. So he has someone else use his car to take wounded soldiers to the hospital. He meets one of his former colleagues, another former general. They recruit a number of soldiers, and they end up getting in there finally, and they free his son and his family. They are a small example of what was going on. One of the most stunning things about what happened is you have small numbers of Israelis rushing down there. Some in small groups of soldiers, some small commando units that they've heard it and they just go down there. You have something that is, again, really hard to imagine. You have typically 4 or 5 Israelis dealing with 60 to 70 Hamas, completely outnumbered, totally outgunned, frequently running out of ammunition. And they fought anyway. We have something else that's happened as a result of this. We had 40 weeks of a grassroots movement in Israel. For those who were doing it, it was to save democracy. They interpreted the effort at the judicial reform. They called it judicial overhaul. They called it a coup. This was, you can look at the elements of the judicial plan. Fundamentally, it was designed to limit the power of the Supreme Court. You can debate whether it was to neuter the Supreme Court. You can debate whether it was designed to politicize it. The Supreme Court is the only institution that preserves separation of powers in Israel. When you hear people say, well, they have a legislature and an executive and a court, no, they have a parliamentary system, which means in the parliament, the largest coalition selects the prime minister. That means the Knesset never blocks the executive branch. It's an extension of the executive branch. So the only block on executive power is the Supreme Court. The reservists who were part of this movement felt, they were called Brothers in Arms, that was the group that organized it. And by the way, the minute Hamas did this, they called on all reservists to go and go back to their units. But their attitude was, we're trying to save democracy, because if we lose separation of powers, there's no break on executive authority and executive power. And again, we can debate, why did the Netanyahu government push this? There are those who have their own views about why Bibi pushed it. It's pretty clear why the religious parties pushed it, because they didn't want the Supreme Court being able to tell them that, no, they actually have to serve. It's pretty obvious why Smotrich and Ben-Gvir were pushing it, because they didn't want the Supreme Court blocking them from being able to take over Palestinian land. The court always says, okay, if it's state land, you don't take it over. If it's private land, you can't take it over. They didn't want that break. So you had these divisions based on this, 40 weeks of an unbelievable movement. Talk about a grassroots movement to save democracy, at least in the minds of those who were out there. It says something remarkable about the depth of the Israeli commitment to preserve their democratic identity. You know, before this all happened, I do a lot of speaking on campuses in addition to teaching at Georgetown. And one of the things I would go and say is, look, if you're looking for a democracy in the Middle East, there's only one. If you're looking for proof that Israelis are committed to preserving their democratic identity, look at what's happening every week. They are demonstrating to the tune of what would be anywhere from 2 to 4 million Americans out demonstrating every week. There isn't a stronger testament to the depth of the democratic ethos in Israel. Now, it did create divisions. It did create polarization. They were a response to what they thought was a threat to Israel's democratic identity. But what happened after what we've seen? What happened after the onslaught? An unbelievable coalescence in Israel. The reservists who were out before, there's an oversubscription. You have people reporting to units when they weren't called. The turnout is 120%. What about throughout the country as a whole? People giving blood? They actually stopped asking for people to give blood because so many came to give blood all over the country. This is still a government that isn't functioning very well. So it is the public that is buying armored vests for a lot of the reservists. It is the public that is organizing and meeting the social needs of the communities that were devastated, not the government. There is this coalescence because what was very stark is Hamas didn't care if you were pro-peace or if you were against giving up anything. They killed a lot of peaceniks down there. They didn't care. And it wasn't just Jews. You know, all the bus drivers at the music festival, they were all Arab. They killed them all. The aim was to go in and just kill. They are ISIS. When the Secretary of Defense says, what I saw here is worse than what I saw when we were fighting ISIS. It was. There are so many things that were done. They're not the kind of things that I can even talk about. But they are the kind of things that need to continue to be exposed because of what's happening in terms of the broader public opinion. It is incomprehensible to me that anybody could have gone and demonstrated for Hamas in the Cannon office building in Washington. If I'd been there, I would have said, so what are you demonstrating for? So it's okay to kill babies? It's okay to kidnap women in wheelchairs? It's okay to rape women? This is what you're doing? This is what you're for? They should be confronted. Any cause that does that, has itself delegitimized itself. And anybody who speaks on behalf of that cause, who says, you know, well, I criticize that, but. There are no buts. There is no equivocation. This is a point of moral clarity. If you are trying to justify that, then you have no moral authority to talk on this issue whatsoever. So why did Hamas do it? Is it just because this is who they are? Well, part of the answer is yes. It is who they are. They are not about occupation. They're about Israel's existence. But that's not the full explanation. The full explanation is this is who Hamas has always been. Every time in the 1990s when I was our negotiator, every single time when we were making progress, every time we got a suicide bombing. After the Rabin assassination, actually I'll say something after the Rabin assassination. 6 months before Rabin was assassinated, he and I used to meet every Shabbat afternoon. We would meet when I was there during the week, but those were all to talk about, okay, here's what we're doing in the negotiations. You know, here was comparing notes. Here's how to coordinate positions. Here's where I might be asking something of him. Here's why he might be asking something of me. That's what we did during the week. On Shabbat afternoons, we had a more strategic discussion. Rabin, there were two things about Rabin that set him apart from any leader I ever knew or worked for, in parentheses. He could not lie. He literally could not lie. He might tell the technical truth, meaning it could be misleading, but he would never tell you something that was untrue. Second thing, I'm going to say three things. The second thing, and this made him unique, he would admit when he was wrong, because there was an intellectual honesty to him. He was the most analytical leader I ever dealt with, and when he had thought something through, it was kind of like a staccato. He would go A, B, C, D. These would be his 4 points, and they would be inherently logical, and they would be based on serious analysis. And if he'd thought that through, you couldn't move him. But if it turned out that he was wrong, and you'd had an argument with him, he'd come back and say to you, I was wrong. You were right. I had other leaders, I won't say who they were, who I dealt with. The only way they would ever admit they were wrong, they would say, I was wrong because I listened to you. That was not Rabin. Rabin was not just honest, He was intellectually honest. He was honest with himself. He had a kind of intrinsic credibility in Israel because everybody knew that he actually was Mr. Security, but they also knew what he said to them is what he believed. So 6 months before his assassination on a Shabbat afternoon, we're talking strategically, and all of a sudden he says to me, "Who do you think is going to determine the next election in Israel?" And I tried to prove to him how smart I was on Israeli politics, so I go, "Ari Deri of Shas." And he goes, "No, guess again." I said, "I'm not playing this game." So he said, "Hamas will determine the next election in Israel. 2 Hamas bombs and I won't be the prime minister." Every time we were making progress, we would get a bomb from Hamas. 3 months after the assassination, when Shimon Peres was wearing the mantle of the assassination, and I was being told by Likudniks, Peres will be able to achieve with Rabin's death what wouldn't have been possible in Rabin's life. In part, by the way, not just because of the mantle of the assassination, but because of the Palestinian response to the assassination. There was an amazing outpouring of grief among Palestinians over the assassination, and it built credibility in the Israeli body politic about the Palestinians. And then Hamas, 4 bombs in 9 days, after Peres had called for an election. He called for early elections. 4 bombs in 9 days. Successive Sundays, the same bus route in Israel being bombed. The day after the second bombing, a bombing in Tel Aviv that killed a number of kids in Purim costumes. The 4th bomb took place, by the 9th day, and it was an earthquake in Israel because Peres went from being in a position where nothing was going to stop his being able to act on fulfilling the Rabin legacy of producing peace, to suddenly people saying, "This is the kind of peace you're going to bring us?" And Netanyahu was elected by a very small margin. When I hear people say, if only there was a peace process, this wouldn't have happened. And I say, no. With Hamas, it's precisely when they think there's going to be something that it happens. The timing was related to the possibility of the normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. Yes, it was planned over a period of time because that's who Hamas is. But the timing was probably a function of 2 things. A perception that Israel was distracted. The one thing I left out of this kind of perfect storm, the military really was focused on, given the reservist issue, there was a distraction. There was. You had the Minister of Defense saying in May that the military was being affected and Israel's security was being affected by proceeding with the reform. And he was initially fired and then he was brought back. So this had an effect on the timing as well. Okay, so what happens now? The one thing you have to start with is an essential premise. Hamas has to be seen in appearance and in fact as having been decisively defeated. There cannot be an outcome where it looks like Hamas gained. When I hear people say Hamas did this to create a trap to suck Israel in to a terrible urban conflict, I don't believe it. I don't believe it because they took all these hostages. They know the history of Israel when it comes to their hostages. Sinwar knows it because he got released. 1,000 prisoners, Palestinians, many with a lot of blood on their hands, were released to get Gilad Shalit back. This was not the only time large numbers of Palestinian prisoners were released to get an Israeli back. And by the way, oftentimes the trades were made not for live Israelis, but for the bodies of dead Israelis. So you're Yahya Sinwar, and you're thinking, what do I need to do to prevent the Israelis from coming all out after us? We'll bring hostages, because then they won't put them at risk and they'll trade something for them. And Palestinian prisoners, they're seen as this, they have an iconic status among Palestinians, because they're seen as, political prisoners who resisted occupation. I used to deal, when I was negotiating, I used to deal with the prisoner families, the Palestinian prisoner families. And they are a potent political force among Palestinians. And so if Hamas has actually succeeded in being able to trade hostages for prisoners, this would be an extraordinary victory for them. Think about it. They go on a killing spree and kill 1,400 in one day in Israel. And then they get Palestinian prisoners released too. They would say, you see, our way works. We will wear Israel down and eventually it will disappear. Don't follow the way of those who are prepared to normalize with Israel. Our way works. So Israel has to prove its way does not work, but it's more than that. Israel had a policy from 2009, and that policy was, we know who Hamas is, we know what their ideology is, but if we have to fight them every couple of years, that's a tolerable price, and it's a much lower price than having to go back into Gaza. Bibi, in his autobiography, there's a page. I was reminded of it because I was on Meet the Press last Sunday, and the first question I got was Bibi in his autobiography explaining why it didn't make sense to go back into Gaza because the price was too high, and he was using it as an argument to say that Naftali Bennett was naive because he had been pushing to go back into Gaza. Now, to be fair, it seemed to be a reasonable argument. Israel got out of Gaza, didn't want to go back in. And yes, it wasn't great to have to live in the south and be subject to this, but you could manage it. And in the end, okay, this was Hamas. There was a kind of strange, rough coexistence. Yes, there was a price, but it was dramatically less than if you have to go back into Gaza and root Hamas out. That was the paradigm from 2009 until a week ago Saturday. And a week ago Saturday, that paradigm and the assumptions behind it were shattered. And today, left to right in Israel, left to right, there is a conviction Israel cannot live with Hamas next to it. Because Israel, in fact, is being asked to live with ISIS next to it. We wouldn't live with ISIS next to us. President Obama, after the beheadings of two American journalists, and after the atrocities committed against the Yazidis in Iraq, said, we are going to destroy ISIS. And when we bombed in Mosul, by the way, is a city about the same size as Gaza City. We bombed in Mosul. There weren't those saying, gee, you can't do that because look at the civilians you're going to kill. By the way, I wish there were. One shouldn't be, killing civilians in warfare without losing part of who you are. How many people here have heard the term proportionality? Proportionality is a legal term in warfare. Proportionality means not that it's tit for tat, not that it should be equal. Proportionality means when you hit military targets, which you have a right to hit, you try to minimize the number of civilian casualties. That's an obligation. It's a legitimate one, and we should feel it. But when it came to ISIS, We didn't seem to be too concerned about it. But the world now applies a different standard to Israel, even though they're living next to ISIS. But that's a reminder for one of the things that we have to do. We collectively, we have to repeat over and over and over again. Would we accept living next to ISIS? Which country in the world is prepared to accept living next to ISIS? There is going to be a battle for public opinion as things go on, because this is going to be a very difficult fight in an urban area. Why have the Israelis not gone in on the ground yet? Although there was an announcement today that they're beginning to go in. We'll see if it's actually a major invasion of Gaza. At some point, the Israeli military will end up taking over all of Gaza, not to keep it, but it will to succeed in doing what it needs to do. It is going to have to take over on the ground. We couldn't root out ISIS in Mosul or in Raqqa without somebody fighting on the ground. We bombed from the air. We used artillery. In Raqqa, we used the Syrian Democratic Forces, 90% of whom are Kurds. They did the fighting on the ground. They lost 11,000 rooting out ISIS from Raqqa after we bombed. So urban warfare, especially in a place that's teeming, where you have narrow roads and alleyways and miles of tunnels, is excruciatingly difficult. Israel has been using bombing to change what they would call the battle space. They've been using bombing to reduce the level of the resistance they will face from Hamas. They have been going in small commando units and grabbing Hamas. And the purpose is not for trade, it's for intelligence. It's partly to learn where the hostages are, but it's also to learn more about where the leaders are. What are the defenses that are set up? Which are the most formidable ones? Hostage rescues and these kinds of operations in general, they take a long time because you have to start with having good intelligence. And it takes time to acquire that. So Israel has an aim. You've heard some people say in Israel, we're going to eradicate Hamas. You can't eradicate Hamas. Hamas is an ideological movement. It may be an abhorrent one, but it's an idea. You have to discredit that idea. You have to show it doesn't work. You have to show the costs of it. What Israel has to do is destroy Hamas's capacity to wage war. And it has to decapitate the leadership. If it does those two things, it will put Hamas in a position where it cannot resist what will be a change within Gaza. And Gaza has to change. In the past, Hamas always had the ability to block or veto any effort to create the following equation: the demilitarization of Gaza for reconstruction. No reconstruction without demilitarization. Hamas was never prepared to accept that. We need to ensure, the Israelis need to ensure, and in effect, this is what President Biden has been saying, that Israel not only has an obligation to, not only has a right to defend itself, it has an obligation to do so. And it can't defend itself if Hamas is allowed to do what it's done in the last 5 times there was a conflict. Each ceasefire allowed Hamas to rebuild itself, to rearm itself, and to position itself for the next round that was going to take place. Okay, they exposed themselves. This was not just about rounds. This was about inflicting as many losses on Israeli life as they could. Well, no more. That's done. So yes, this will be a difficult military operation. Yes, it will take place in a very difficult political climate. Yes, it requires an active effort to say, this is about ensuring that Israel never faces that threat again. This is about dealing with ISIS next door because no one else would deal or live with ISIS. And we're not going to ask Israel to live with ISIS. So what comes next? Assuming Israel can do what I just said. What comes next is you put Hamas in a position where it can't resist, where it loses its ability to coerce. It's not just that it loses its ability to threaten Israel, it loses its ability to coerce the Palestinians. That means it not just taking away their military capacity, it means doing as much disarmament of the Hamas and killing as many of the Hamas operatives as you can. If they can't veto reconstruction because there's going to be demilitarization, they won't be able to veto either a new administration within Gaza, which should be made up of Palestinian technocrats. Palestinians, may surprise you, Palestinians have, on a per capita basis, the highest number of advanced degrees of anybody in the Arab world. They are tremendously successful in their diasporas. You allow Palestinian technocrats to manage the place. You create an international umbrella under which they will be operating. You bring in a number of Arab states to be police forces because there has to be security. And it shouldn't be one, it should be Morocco, it should be Egypt, it should be Bahrain, it should be the UAE. Each would have a responsibility for policing parts of Gaza. The Saudis and the Qataris should be responsible for funding the reconstruction. And I believe actually you'll find they'll be willing to do so. Because in the aftermath of this, they will have an interest in showing they came in to rescue the Palestinians in the aftermath of what is going to be a terrible cost for them to pay. But again, I say, who's responsible for that? Hamas. You can also, I believe, if Hamas loses decisively, Saudi Arabia will be interested again in doing a normalization deal with Israel. And there needs to be a Palestinian component to that in a way that preserves the possibility of a two-state outcome. I say that because there is going to be not just a political reckoning in Israel. There is going to be, for the first time, a serious debate about what the future should be between Israel and the Palestinians. There will be this will be a debate. It will be divided in two. There will be those who will say, look, you saw what happened in Gaza. We can't afford to have a Palestinian state because that's what could emerge there. That'll be an argument. And there'll be a counter-argument. And the counter-argument will be, if we destroy Hamas, we can't then freeze the situation on our terms in a way that basically produces the kind of anger and despair among Palestinians that you're going to create the follow-on to Hamas. I can tell you, Israel does not want to drift into becoming one state. If it becomes one state, the Palestinians will not lose their national identity, so there'll be resistance. Two nationalities in one state. There was a Palestinian I knew who was a member of what was known as the Tanzim in the West Bank. He was close to Marwan Barghouti, and he said to me, look, in one state, either the Israelis will try to dominate us or we will try to dominate them. He said, I'm for two states because that's the only way we can coexist. I don't expect there's going to come a moment where everyone's going to sit down and sing Kumbaya. I don't see that. This is more likely a divorce than it is a marriage. But there can be such things as amiable divorces too. And it's a whole lot better than living with a process that, once again, you can see, the cliff that Israel's coming up on. But one of the things that gives me encouragement is there will be a reckoning and there will be a debate. There'll be a reckoning because Israel is democracy, and there'll be accountability. And there'll be a debate because Israel is a democracy, and this needs to be thrashed out by them, not by us. We can have a position. This is Israel defining its future, not us defining its future. And in the aftermath of what they've just lived through, you will see, just as they showed up on the streets to protect democracy, they will show up to debate and resolve what their future should be. And we, as a collective, we need to be supportive of it. There hasn't just been a coalescence within Israel, there's been a remarkable coalescence of the Jewish community as well, in the States and elsewhere. We have that obligation to support them now, because Israel has never been as threatened as they have been today, and we have a reminder. The reminder is, there's a reason that Israel exists, and ultimately exists for all of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. When we were at dinner, please take a drink. When we were at dinner, Ambassador Ross mentioned that one of the ways that he got so involved in politics was by asking people, is that really the question you want to ask? So now I have the tough job of asking questions so you can reframe them and say, is that really the question you want to ask? I'm going to start out with a question. Can you explain what Arab countries are doing or not doing for Palestinian civilians and also in terms of the Arab Street riots?
Well, the short answer is very little. I want to explain something. So about a little over 10% of the Ukrainian population was basically absorbed, became refugees and left because of what Russia was doing. They became absorbed into the neighboring states. Poland took a huge number of Ukrainians, but it wasn't only Poland. So some people say, well, look, why can't the Arabs do the same thing? And it's part of what I'll call the broader narrative among Arabs that that this is Israel's problem, and they shouldn't relieve Israel of the problem of dealing with the Palestinians. Their view is, they convince themselves over time, this is all part of a plan to depopulate and force Palestinians out. And they won't be a party to forcing Palestinians out. So they're not doing very much. What I was suggesting, if Hamas is seen as losing, I believe you'll see them be prepared then to do much more. Because then they'll want to show, here's what we're doing for Palestinians. I believe there's a good possibility of that. If Hamas is seen as not losing, if they can claim they can win, they won't be involved at all. And by the way, you'll see all those who have been keen on normalizing becoming very hesitant to do so. Because I said it during the talk, Hamas has an ideology of rejection. And what will happen is that ideology of rejection will suddenly look like it's being validated. Look, their way, as I said, their way works. That'll put all these regimes on the defensive. It's not just that Israel needs them to lose for its own sake, because it reestablishes Israel's deterrent. But it's also necessary for the shape and the future of the Middle East for them to be seen as losing.
Thank you. There were quite a few questions about U.S.'s involvement, specifically as pertains to funding. And I'm just going to leave that open-ended and let you kind of share a little bit about that with us.
You were here and not listening to President Biden's speech, and neither was I listening to it. But I do suspect that a major part of the speech was his making the case for why he is asking the Congress to produce a very large package of support for Israel. It is noteworthy, by the way, again, I talked about the Jewish community. So the federation system has called for creating a national emergency fund in the last week of $500 million for Israel. I can tell you the federation system has already raised $388 million within the space of this time.
Can you address, if you would, address a little bit about support financially and the conversations that came about Iran and the U.S.?
All right, so like many issues, look, we've just seen how easy it is to build misinformation that creates a whole different impression by distorting facts. The bombing that wasn't has created really a terrible environment in which we're now operating, the Israelis are now operating. Because here's a lie that took on a life of its own, and the truth can't penetrate it. Now, I'm not about to say that what the administration has done on Iran is necessarily exactly what I would have been doing on Iran. I'm not about to say that because it's not what I would have necessarily doing. But I do think there are some distortions that have been made about how the Biden administration has been pushing billions of dollars onto the Iranians, and that made this all possible. So let's deal with facts, not with fantasy. There has been about $2.75 billion that Iraq was permitted to turn over to Iran. Iran was providing natural gas, not oil, natural gas, because Iraq has a lot of oil. They were providing natural gas to the Iraqis, and especially at a time when they were having economic difficulties during COVID, and they ran up a bill of $11 billion. We told them, the administration told them, post-COVID, that you can't turn that money over because of our sanctions. The Iraqis kept coming to us and said, look, they're going to stop providing natural gas, which we still need. We don't have alternatives. They've actually been selling it to us at under market prices, and you're going to destabilize Iraq if this is the case. Do you really want to destabilize? Do you want to push us more into their arms where we become even more dependent? So the administration, after more than a year, said, okay, of the 11 billion, you can provide 2.75. Okay, so that's where one chunk of money comes from. Now the second is the release of these 5 dual citizens, Iranian Americans, who were held as hostages. And the negotiation involved $6 billion. I explained to someone earlier in the reception, it was actually $7 billion. South Korea paid Iran $7 billion for oil, for Iranian oil. But that was then subject to the bank, so it went into an account that was, subject to sanctions, so it went into an account that was frozen. Now the South Koreans devalued their currency, so the $7 billion actually became $6 billion. What was negotiated was the money would be sent to an account in Qatar. The account could not be treated as cash. It would be treated as money to buy only commodities related to food, medicine, or medical devices. Only those 3 items. There would be, to draw it down, you had to come in with a bill of lading that would be given to the Qataris that we would see, and then the money would go to the vendor. The money wouldn't go to the Iranians. Okay, so that sounds pretty good, right? Now, is there a flaw in that? Yes, because money's fungible. So if they know they have $6 billion that they can spend on these other kinds of items, they can divert monies away to supporting their proxies. Now, do I believe they're going to divert all that money away? No, they have really serious domestic problems. Do I think, would I be surprised if they diverted $1 billion of the $6 billion? No, I would not be surprised. We have to have an approach towards Iran that requires us to squeeze them. Their militias today, for the first time in about 6 months, fired rockets at our positions, I think in Syria and Iraq, and we lost an American civilian contractor. Now, there had been a kind of quiet understanding, apparently, because there had been no attacks for months, that if they stopped doing this, then we wouldn't carry out any attacks against them. The administration will have to think hard, what does it want to do right now? We have committed a lot of force to the Eastern Mediterranean. I want to explain in a second what that force is. But most of you have probably heard today the Houthis from Yemen fired missiles at Israel, and our naval forces in the Red Sea intercepted all the missiles. So this is an interesting message to Iran and to Hezbollah, that when President Biden says don't, it's backed up by something that isn't just words. Will we act now? Look, with the preoccupation, and I didn't deal with one of the issues that I'll probably be asked about, which is, will there be a northern front with Hezbollah? One of the issues is, how much do you want to divide your attention? And some people will say this is precisely the time, because everyone's mobilized, to take on all of the threats. Others will say, you know, to be able to succeed in your objectives vis-a-vis Hamas, you need to focus on that and get it done. Now, Hezbollah, I'll provide my own segue. I do it seamlessly.
It's wonderful. It makes my job a lot easier. Please.
Hezbollah has been heating up further. There's been an exchange of fire across the border. It's become more intense over the last week. The Israelis have lost 6 soldiers. Hezbollah isn't admitting how many they've lost. These are exchanges basically against military targets, which is already different from Hamas. It's a form of signaling. If Hezbollah intended to come in, there'd be a rocket on Tel Aviv. Then you're off to the races. Now, even with this kind of signaling at force, you can hit the wrong target, and you can be off to the races. What you're seeing right now is a kind of deliberate effort to keep this localized, which allows Hezbollah to demonstrate they're doing something, but doesn't trigger an all-out war. It has brought, I can tell you, yesterday there were there was a tweet, and then there was Khalid Mashal, one of the former leaders of Hamas, who lives in a 5-star hotel in Qatar. He really suffers greatly, who basically questioned, where was Hezbollah? Hamas, in another sign that it's feeling what the Israelis are doing, was out there pushing for, where is the alliance of resistance? They should all be opening up the fronts. Now, tomorrow is a Friday, and they're calling for days of rage in the West Bank, and we'll see what's happened. Israel has arrested 574 Hamas operatives in the West Bank. And it's doing that, I think, in part, not only to try to control their effort in incitement, but I think they may be doing it in part also as a way of preventing any move against the Palestinian Authority. So there already your attention is diverted in a number of ways, but it's not the same as if Hezbollah came in. Hezbollah is much stronger than Hamas. Hezbollah has 150,000 rockets. 75,000 of those have range and payload that can cover most of Israel. 1,000 are precision guided, which means the way the missile defense system works, the way the Iron Dome works, everything the radar is the brain of the system. The radar distinguishes the path that a rocket's coming in on, and if it's not going to hit a strategic target, either military or civilian or economic, then it doesn't go after it. It hits in an open space. Now, when you have that many rockets that Hezbollah has, you can swamp the system, you can saturate it. Then that requires Israel, by definition, to go in on the ground. Because Israel will take from Hezbollah 3,000 rockets a day for a month. You know, it has to go in on the ground. The price will be very high for Israel, for its soldiers, and the price will be dramatically higher for Lebanon. And Nasrallah knows that. So he also knows his own base doesn't want a war. So his instinct is to demonstrate he's doing something, but not to start a war. What about Iran? Iran looks at Hezbollah as its kind of reserve. What's very interesting is that several days before the attack into Israel, the supreme leader, a title I've always liked, by the way.
Me too, but I'm only the associate rabbi, so I'm not even near it. So.
Yeah, but you can aspire to it.
Aspire, sure, but way down the line, yes. Supreme leader, way down the line, yeah.
I'm happy to come back when you are.
Done, sold.
Okay. So he gave a speech where he attacked normalization. Of course, he doesn't call it Israel, he called it the Zionist entity. And then, on the day of the attack, while they celebrated what Hamas did, the Iranians came out and said, "We didn't do it." What does that tell you? They were afraid they were going to be hit. Now they use Hezbollah as a reserve or a deterrent against being hit by Israel. They know that Israel, at a certain point, could come after their nuclear infrastructure, which they've spent 40 years building. And while Israel can't do to it what we could do to it, they can still do a lot to it. So, do they want to exhaust their deterrent? A lot of it comes down to how valuable is Hamas to them as an instrument. If they decide that the defeat and large-scale destruction of Hamas as an instrument is worth enough to them, they could say to Hezbollah, "You got to go." That could happen. I don't rule it out. We'll have a better sense of what happens when Israel has gone into Gaza. Hezbollah could raise the ante and not do something that signals all-out war. As long as they keep everything that they're doing localized in the north, even if they do more, they're sending the signal, we're prepared to keep this limited. And Israel, for its own reasons, is prepared to keep it limited because the focus has to be Gaza.
Thank you. So, what we are dealing with a lot in the U.S. is the growing anti-Israel and anti-Semitic sentiment. And what should we be doing? How can we combat that, especially on college campuses?
A, we have to have a voice. B, we have to think very hard about what's the right message. My suggestion to you is the U.S. would not live with ISIS next to it. Why would we expect or ask Israel to do so? And it's not just the U.S. Would any of our allies live with ISIS next to it? I don't think so. So I think we keep the focus on that. We keep the focus on what Hamas/ISIS did. We keep the focus on don't repeat the mistakes of the past where you allow them just to resume and rebuild. And I think you keep hitting on what they did. You know, unfortunately, I wish what I'm about to say would have more resonance than it does. Yeah, isn't it remarkable? I once got an argument. I was challenged by someone who said, "Well, aren't you troubled by the fact that," this was back in 2014, "aren't you troubled by the fact that there are so few Israeli casualties and so many Palestinian ones?" And I said, "I'm troubled by the fact that that Hamas doesn't care enough about its own public to protect it." I said, "Why do you think? It's not just Iron Dome. Israel has a very significant civil defense capability. Look, I have a son, daughter-in-law, and 3 grandsons who live in Ramat Aviv. They're living right now in one room at night, sleep at night in one room together, because if a siren goes off, they have to take the little boys and move them into the safe room. Do the Palestinians have safe rooms? No. Do they have shelters? No. They have miles and miles of tunnels. Are any of the Palestinians who live there allowed to go in the tunnels? No. Only Hamas fighters, leaders, and weapons. Is there a reason that the Palestinians lose so much? Yes, because Hamas uses their whole public as human shields. That should have more resonance than it does. Maybe this is ISIS and no one can live with it. That's likely to have more. And again, what they did has to constantly be front and center. But we have to have a collective voice, and we have to push back. You don't take this. You don't allow these arguments to go unchallenged.
So with that, what resources do you recommend that we use to be able to have the facts, to be able to learn more, to be able to share with people who have that anti-Israel, anti-Semitic sentiment?
Well, look, I read the Times of Israel every day, which I think is probably the best source out of Israel. It's very balanced. I read a lot of other things as well. There is a regional newspaper called Shaq al-Asad. It is funded by the Saudis. It is based in London. And you can get it not only in Arabic, but in English. And it actually has had a diversity of opinion in it. And it's worth reading it to sort of get a sense of what's the discussion in the Arab world. So I read that. I read like The Atlantic. I mean, these are the things that I read. I mean, I read other things too. Look, I'm at the Washington Institute. Go on the Washington Institute for Near East Policy's website. That's probably, if you really want to get a complete sense of what's going on, go on the website and you can read it. It's called the Washington Institute for Near East Policy.
This is on live stream, so you can all go back and watch it later if you need these again. So I'm going to end with how can we be the most effective here in the States for Israel? So you talked about Federation's initiatives. Our Federation has also continued with that initiative with a wonderful, generous matching donor from the Bar Yadin Family Foundation. And just curious, how can we support Israel from here?
Well, I do think financially it's very important because the cost of this is going to be enormous. Think about how many people are mobilized. That the mobilization fundamentally affects the functioning of the economy. So there is a need for very extensive financial support. That's why I said what Biden is asking for the Congress to do, and maybe at some point there'll be a speaker again. You know why that's important? Because the speaker determines what's the agenda. Right now, there is a very strong majority in the House to support a large package of assistance to Israel, but you don't have anybody who can put it on the agenda. Now, you can probably come up with some legerdemain where you create some temporary speaker or something that is the equivalent of it that allows you to put this on the agenda. The administration, I'm sure that Biden is asking for Israel, but also for Ukraine.
He is. I got an update while you were speaking. Right. Yes.
Well, it would be, look, why do you think Putin is so happy about what's going on? Because he sees it diverting attention away from Ukraine. His strategy, once it became clear that his military was basically a large Potemkin village, it became a strategy of attrition because of numbers and the ability to last longer, and his expectation that we would grow weary of supporting Ukraine. And he thinks that this is great because this will make it much more likely that we'll grow weary of supporting Ukraine. the fact is, we have to be able to do both. We are seeing, by the way, a manifestation of why only the U.S. can play certain roles. All those who favor us withdrawing, when you withdraw, this is what you get. You know, the book I'm writing is about why we can't withdraw, what we have to do to be able to sustain a presence, because it's not so easy when we're not so unified. It has to be conditioned, it has to relate to how we see ourselves and how we define some of our traditions. We have to use the tools of statecraft, meaning all the tools available to us, much more effectively than we have in the past, because then it becomes more justifiable. We look more effective. You know, there's an old saying, nothing succeeds like success. So the more we look like we're effective in terms of what we're doing, the more we'll be able to sustain it. And good statecraft always involves marrying objectives and means. You would be surprised how rarely we actually do that. But after everybody reads my new book, you'll all know.
And that is a way to end it. Thank you so much, Ambassador Ross, for being here with us tonight. I'll take that for me.